The station called Axis Eternal hung between 3 star systems like a cold jewel suspended in total darkness. It rotated so slowly that most visitors never noticed the movement at all, and those visitors were far too busy staring at the interior to pay attention to the outside anyway. The Grand Hall of the Galactic Conclave was carved from the hollowed core of an ancient asteroid, and it was so enormous that sound traveled strangely inside it. Voices became echoes before the speaker had even finished talking, and footsteps disappeared into the dark stone floor as if the building itself preferred silence above all other things. Sergeant Ethan Cole stood near the back wall of that hall and tried very hard to look like furniture. He was good at it. 14 years of military service had taught him how to go still, how to breathe quietly, how to occupy space without demanding that anyone notice him. And that particular skill was the main reason Ambassador Reyes had selected him for this posting in the first place. "You are here to look human and say nothing," Reyes had told him on the transport over, straightening Ethan's collar with the efficiency of a man who had very little patience for soldiers at diplomatic events. "Do not touch anything. Do not speak to the delegates unless they speak to you first, and under absolutely no circumstances are you to draw that sidearm." The sidearm in question sat on Ethan's hip inside a sealed housing, a small locked casing fitted over the trigger mechanism that the Earth government had agreed to as a condition of humanity's observer status at the conclave. It was, Ethan had privately decided, the most honest symbol of humanity's position in the entire galaxy that anyone had ever invented. Armed, technically, but not permitted to act on it. Earth had been sitting at the outer edges of galactic civilization for 30 years now. 30 years of careful treaties, of agreements written in humble language, of Earth's banner hanging in the dim far corners of important rooms while the great and ancient species stood comfortably in the light at the center. And Ethan understood that the ambassador's caution came from a real and serious place, from the weight of knowing that humans were new here and considered small here, and that a single mistake made in a room like this one could cost something that took a generation to rebuild. He understood all of that. He stood still and watched the room anyway, the way soldiers watch rooms, not admiring the architecture, not reading the sigil banners of 43 member species that hung from the high ceiling, not studying the layered crystal panels that caught the light and scattered it in colors no human word existed to name yet. He watched the people. The Vethkai delegation arrived at the 23rd minute of the pre-ceremony gathering, and they were impossible to miss. Each of them stood nearly 7 feet tall, silver-skinned, moving with the kind of deliberate and controlled precision that comes only from a culture that has been practicing formal movement for many hundreds of years. They had 4 arms arranged in 2 pairs at the shoulder, and their skin produced a soft bioluminescent glow that shifted between colors depending on their emotional state. They way a human face might flush or pale, except the Vethkai could not fully control it no matter how hard they tried. Most of the other delegates in the hall were not familiar enough with Vethkai physiology to read those color changes. Ethan was also not familiar with them. But he noticed the young woman near the rear of the delegation anyway. She was dressed more elaborately than the others around her, her robes layered in deep blue and silver silk that shifted tone with her movement, and her upper 2 arms carried the formal rank bands of a noble house. But her skin was dim, noticeably dimmer than every other Vethkai in the group, held at a flat and careful grey that appeared to be maintained with genuine effort, the way a person holds their expression. Perfectly neutral when they are working very hard on the inside not to let anything show. Her name was Velshera, daughter of High Sovereign Velmaran of the Vethkai Noble Assembly, but Ethan did not know that yet. He watched her move through the pre-ceremony greetings with perfect posture and a face that gave nothing away to anyone who was not paying close attention, and he watched her eyes travel to the exits, not once, not twice, but 3 separate times in the first 4 minutes. Not the casual curious glances of someone bored at a long event, but the quick and practiced sweeps of a person who is quietly calculating distance, measuring speed, considering whether the space between where she stood and where the door was could be crossed before anyone reacted. He had seen that particular look before, in narrow streets in places with difficult names, in crowded checkpoints where the wrong person held all the authority in the room. It was the look of someone deciding whether running was possible and where they would go if they committed to it. He leaned slightly toward Ambassador Reyes. "That woman in the Vethkai group," he said, keeping his voice low and his eyes forward. "The one in the blue robes, she keeps checking the doors." Reyes did not turn his head. "Stand straight, Sergeant." "She looks frightened, sir." Everyone looks tense at the rite of accord. It is an extremely significant ceremony. Stand straight and stop profiling the guests. That is not what you are here for. Ethan stood straight. He did not stop watching. The rite of accord began at the precise scheduled moment with the kind of punctuality that the conclave considered sacred. A herald announced the proceedings simultaneously in 6 languages through the translation matrices embedded throughout the hall, and the assembled delegates arranged themselves into the formal witness configuration, a wide half-circle of species standing at carefully measured distances from one another, because in conclave tradition, physical proximity between delegations communicated political relationship, and no one wanted to communicate the wrong thing by accident. At the center of the ceremony floor, the Korvan warlord named Drethoka took his position. He stood a full head above even the Vethkai and was built in the way that suggested his species had at some point collectively decided that being difficult to move was a survival strategy worth committing to entirely. His skin was dark and rough, and his eyes caught the light in a flat and uninterested way, the eyes of someone accustomed to rooms arranging themselves around his presence. The herald called Velshera forward by her full noble title. She walked to the center of the ceremony floor with her posture straight and her chin level and her skin held at that careful flat gray, and Ethan watched her lower 2 hands, the ones partially hidden in the fall of her robes, moving in a small and constant pattern against her sides, fingers pressing and releasing in a steady rhythm that looked like someone counting silently in their head or holding themselves together very deliberately from somewhere deep inside. The warlord looked at her the way a person looks at something they have already decided belongs to them. Across the hall, the assembled delegates began the formal applause of ceremony proceeding correctly, measured and even and entirely satisfied with itself, and through the width of the entire grand hall, through 43 species and their banners and their careful political arrangements, Velshera's eyes found Ethan Cole standing in the dim corner near the back wall. She looked at him for exactly 1 second. It was not a curious look, and it was not a random one. It was the look of someone who had already checked every door in the room and found them all sealed shut, and was now looking at the only thing left in the room that was not a door but might still be the only possible direction left to move toward. Ethan did not look away from her. The warlord's hand moved with the slow certainty of a being who had never once been refused anything in his entire life. It crossed the distance between them with the casual ease of someone reaching for an object placed on a table. Not a gesture of aggression, not a display of force, but something quieter and more absolute than either of those things. It was the movement of a person who simply did not consider that the thing he was reaching for had an opinion about being reached for. His massive fingers closed around Velshera's upper wrist, the left one, the highest of her 4 arms, and the grip locked with a soft and final pressure that carried the full ceremonial weight of the Vethkai bonding rite, the ancient gesture of claiming that their culture had used for centuries to formalize ownership between houses, the gesture that every delegate in the room recognized and every herald had been waiting for. The hall applauded. Not loudly. The right of accord demanded measured witness, not celebration, but the sound moved through the assembled delegates in a wave of polite and satisfied approval, the sound of important people watching something they considered correct proceeding correctly, the sound of a room full of species who had arranged themselves into the formal witness configuration and were now confirming with their hands that the arrangement was acceptable to them. Velshera's skin did not stay grey. It could not. The careful flat control she had held across her entire body for the past hour cracked open all at once. From the base of her neck to the tips of all 4 hands, her bioluminescence erupted in white, not the soft white of calm or the cool white of concentration, but the sharp and flooding white that the Vethkai carry as the deepest color in their emotional language, the one that has no subtle meaning, the one that means only one thing in any context and has meant only that one thing for as long as the Vethkai have existed. It meant absolute terror. Every Vethkai in the room saw it. The guards, the delegation members, the herald, every single one of them saw her skin go white, and every single one of them went absolutely still in a way that was different from the formal stillness of the ceremony, a stillness that came from somewhere much older than protocol. The other species in the room saw a light change and assumed it was decorative. The warlord's grip did not loosen. And then Velshera ran. She did not run the way a person runs who has planned an escape. There was no angled route, no calculated path toward a door or a neutral zone or a position of legal safety. She simply pulled away from the warlord's hand with everything she had, and the surprise of it more than the strength of it broke the grip, and then she was moving across the ceremony floor with her robes tearing at the hem where her feet caught the fabric, her 4 arms tucked close against her body, her skin cycling through white and red and a deep and desperate amber, every color of a person who has stopped thinking about consequences and started thinking only about distance. The hall did not applaud now. The hall went silent the way a room goes silent when something happens inside it that the room does not have a prepared response for, when the event falls outside every script that every person in attendance had been given and rehearsed and considered sufficient. Velshera ran the full length of the grand hall. She ran past the neutral arbiters in their grey ceremonial robes who stood with their mouths open and their hands at their sides. She ran past the shriven collective delegation who stepped back as one unit. She ran past the corner where Earth's banner hung in the dim and distant section of the room that no one important ever stood near, and she ran directly and without slowing into the chest of Sergeant Ethan Cole. The impact was real. She was taller than him by nearly a foot, and the full momentum of her run transferred into him completely. He stepped back once with his right foot to absorb it, the automatic physical adjustment of someone who has been hit before and knows how to receive force without falling, and then he stopped moving. Her hands found his jacket, all four of them, grabbing fistfuls of the rough dark fabric of his dress uniform, her upper hands at his shoulders and her lower hands at his sides, holding on with the complete and undignified desperation of someone who has picked the one thing in the room they are going to hold and has decided with their entire body that they are not going to let go of it. She pressed her face against his shoulder. Her skin, which had been cycling through every color of distress faster than any I could properly track, began very slowly to change. The white faded, the red faded, the cycling slowed, and what replaced it was a low and trembling gold that spread from her face and her neck and moved outward through her arms and hands, unsteady and uncertain but present, a color that pulsed at the same rhythm as a slow and deliberate breath. In Vethkai bio-language, it was the color of a child finding shelter in the dark. It meant safety and please and I am trusting you with something I cannot protect by myself, all at the same time, in a single color that no spoken language in the Conclave's translation matrices had ever been asked to convert into words. Ethan did not know what the color meant. He understood her anyway. His arms came up, not quickly, not with any urgency or drama. They came up the way a person moves when they have already made a decision, and the decision is simple, steady and unhurried. One hand settling against the middle of her back and the other rising slowly to rest at the back of her head, pressing her gently against him in the way that humans hold people who are frightened, a gesture with no political translation in any known galactic language, a thing that humans do for each other so automatically that most of them have never once stopped to consider what it communicates or why it works. It communicated, "You are here, I am here, nothing is touching you right now." High Warden Ounsketh moved. He was the commander of the Vethkai Honor Guard, and he had 12 soldiers behind him, and every single one of them was physically larger than Ethan Cole by a margin that should have made this a very short and very simple situation. They stepped forward from their position along the ceremonial wall, and they crossed half the distance between themselves and the human sergeant, and then they stopped. They stopped because Ethan raised his eyes. He did not reach for his sidearm. The sealed housing sat exactly where it had been. He did not change his posture or raise his voice or do any of the things that the guard's training had taught them to categorize as threat indicators. He simply lifted his gaze from the top of Velshera's head and looked across the room at Ounsketh with an expression that was entirely calm and entirely still and communicated something that none of the guards had a word for. It was not aggression. They knew aggression. They had training for aggression. Aggression was a thing they understood how to respond to. It was not submission. Submission carried its own signals, its own postures, its own readable language. This was nothing like that. It was something that sat in a place between those two things that the Vethkai had no category for at all, a flatness, a patience, a total absence of the social anxiety that every species displayed in some form when confronted with 12 armed guards, the expression of a person who had made their decision before the moment arrived and was now simply waiting to see what the moment decided to do about it. The 12 guards stood frozen. Ambassador Reyes had gone the color of a wall. The warlord's entire body was vibrating with a rage so large and so sudden that he appeared to have temporarily forgotten what the correct next action was. And Ethan Cole held Velshera against his chest in the middle of the grand hall of the Galactic Conclave, in front of 43 species and their banners, and said in a voice that was quiet enough to be personal and steady enough to carry clearly through the silence of the entire enormous room. "I have got you. Do not let go." The next 4 hours were the most complicated 4 hours in the diplomatic history of the Galactic Conclave, and the Conclave was 460 years old. Ambassador Reyes spent the first 20 minutes of those 4 hours standing in the middle of the grand hall with a communication device pressed against his ear and the expression of a man watching something very expensive fall from a very high place in very slow motion. He was talking to Earth's senior diplomatic office, who were talking to 3 legal teams, who were all talking over each other in the way that legal teams do when the situation they are being asked to address is one that no law was ever specifically written to address. Because no law had been written for this. Ethan stood at the center of the hall and Velshera stood at his side, and her hand was in his hand now, not with the desperate grip of her initial run, but with the quiet and deliberate hold of someone who has decided that this connection is the one thing in the room that is currently real to them, and they are not releasing it until they feel ready, and they do not feel ready yet. The 12 guards of the Vethkai Honor Unit had not moved from where they had stopped. High Warden Ounsketh had not moved either. He stood at a distance of approximately 15 feet from Ethan and studied him with the focused and analytical attention of a military commander who is trying to understand a situation that does not fit into any tactical category he was trained to use. The way a person stares at a lock they have never seen before, not angry at it yet, simply genuinely trying to work out where the mechanism is. The conclave's neutral arbiters had arranged themselves in a loose ring around the situation and were speaking rapidly to each other in low voices. They were pulling up sections of the neutral ground accord on their ceremonial tablets, scrolling through 4 centuries of legal text looking for the paragraph that covered this exact event, and they were not finding it quickly. What they did find, at the 40-minute mark, was a passage from the Accord's 3rd revision that had been written 230 years ago during a conflict between 2 species whose names Ethan had never learned. The passage stated that under the conditions of the conclave's neutral ground designation, a declared protector could not be forcibly separated from a ward who had chosen them voluntarily, and that neither could be compelled by any party without the protector's formal surrender or a proven violation of conclave law. The chief arbiter read the passage twice and then looked at Ethan with an expression that suggested she was not entirely sure how she felt about what she was about to say. She said it anyway. The law was the law, and the Accord was the Accord, and as long as Velshera remained where she was and Ethan remained where he was, the situation was technically a protected configuration under existing conclave statute. The warlord made a sound that required no translation. The first formal demand came from the Corvan delegation, and it was delivered by a representative who had the posture of someone who expected their words to produce immediate and visible results. He stated that the human sergeant had interfered with a sanctioned right of accord and that the appropriate consequence was immediate detainment, formal censure of the Earth delegation, and a review of humanity's observer status at the conclave. Ethan listened to the full statement through the translation matrix feeding into his earpiece. Then he asked, in a voice that was polite and clear and carried no particular emotion in any direction, "Did she want this?" The representative stopped. He looked at Ethan the way a person looks at someone who has just asked a question so outside the expected structure of the conversation that the brain needs a moment to accept that the question was real. He did not answer it. The second demand came from the Vethkai delegation itself. Ounsketh delivered it personally, standing at his full height in full ceremonial armor with the bearing of a soldier who takes his duty seriously and has never once doubted that his duty was correct. He formally charged Ethan with the Vethkai offense of defilement of noble protocol, a charge that carried significant cultural and legal weight in Vethkai society. Ethan listened to the entire charge. Then he asked, "Did she want this?" Ounsketh's expression shifted, a very small shift, barely visible, the kind of movement that happens in a face when a thought arrives that the person was not expecting and is not yet sure what to do with. He did not answer the question either. The third demand came from 2 mid-level conclave officials who informed Ethan with genuine and obvious discomfort that Earth could lose its observer status entirely, that the political damage to humanity's standing in the conclave could take decades to repair, that he needed to understand the scale of what his actions were costing and release Velshera to the care of her delegation immediately. Ethan looked at them for a long moment. Then he asked, "Did she want this?" The officials looked at each other. Nobody answered. It was the delegate from the Shriven Collective who first understood what Ethan was doing, a small and pale person standing at the far edge of the formal witness ring who had been recording the situation on a personal device since the moment Velshera ran. She had been quiet through every demand and every charge and every response, watching Ethan ask the same question and watching the same silence follow it. And at some point during that process her expression had moved from shock to something much more focused. The Shriven Collective had been a subjugated people once, not ancient history, not far-off memory, but within living generational distance. They knew what it looked like when a room full of important voices found reasons not to answer an obvious question, and they recognized the question itself because their own history was built on the long and painful effort of getting powerful rooms to finally answer it. She did not stop recording. And then Velshera spoke. She spoke in standard because Ethan's translation matrix could carry it and because she wanted him to hear it without the half-second delay of the hall's general translation system. She spoke quietly and she spoke without the formal structure of Vethkai noble address, the way a person speaks when they are saying something true, and the formal structure would make it feel less true rather than more. She told him about the Corvan hegemony. Not the version in the Conclave's official records, not the diplomatic language of alliance and partnership, but the version that her father had explained to her 6 months ago in a private room with no advisors present, the version where the word alliance was a word that the Corvan used to mean acquisition, where the species they formed alliances with became holdings rather than partners, where the noble daughter delivered into a binding right became a symbol of her house's permanent debt and permanent loyalty and permanent availability to Corvan authority. She told him her father had been paid. She told him that under Vethkai law she had no standing to refuse a right authorized by her house's head, that the law that governed her people had never been asked to imagine a situation where the head of a house would sell what the right was supposed to honor, that the law had gaps in it the size of a person, and she had been standing in one of those gaps for 6 months with nowhere to go. She told him she had looked across the hall for the one face that had noticed her, not as a noble, not as a symbol, not as a piece of the ceremony, but as a person who was frightened in a room that was not going to help her, and she had run toward it because it was the only direction that felt like it led somewhere real. Ethan listened to every word of it. Then he looked up at the gallery of watching species, the recorded faces, the open devices, the shriven delegates still recording, and he said in a voice that was not loud but was very clear and was aimed at the translation matrices on purpose so that every species in the hall received it in their own language without any loss. Then we have a problem, because where I come from, that is not a pact, that is a sale, and I do not care what hall we are standing in. The recording went wide across the conclave network at the 42nd second after he finished speaking. And across the hall the warlord looked at his delegation and his delegation looked at him, and a decision was made without words between them, the kind of decision that powerful people make when the room has shifted under them and they need to decide quickly whether to adjust or to act. His hand moved toward his weapon. The warlord's hand did not reach his weapon, because the warlord was not the one who moved first. It was the 4 Korvan soldiers stationed along the far ceremonial wall who moved first. They had been standing in formal position for 4 hours while their commander endured the most public and recorded humiliation of his political career, and when his hand shifted toward his side they understood the signal the way soldiers understand signals, immediately and without question, and they were moving before the warlord's palm had fully closed. They were large, larger than the Vethkai, built with the wide and forward-heavy frame of a species whose ancestors had competed for survival against things considerably bigger than themselves and won. And they crossed the floor with the speed of trained combatants who had been standing still for too long and were very ready to stop standing still. Ambassador Reyes made a sound that was not a word. Ethan had already moved Velshera behind him. He did it without looking at her, one hand on her near shoulder, firm pressure applied in the direction of behind and stay, the silent and physical vocabulary of someone repositioning another person in a space that is about to become complicated. And then his right hand dropped to his hip and his thumb found the safety housing on his sidearm, and he pressed the release mechanism with the short and practiced twist of someone who had thought about how to do that quickly on a day when thinking quickly was necessary. The sealed housing fell to the floor. The sidearm came up. He did not fire. He gave them one instruction. He said it in Standard because Standard was the language the translation matrices would carry fastest across the hall. Stop where you are. And the words were calm and they were clear, and they carried in them the tone of someone who is not asking, not suggesting, not hoping, but simply stating the boundary of a situation in the same way that a wall states the boundary of a room. The 4 soldiers did not stop. So the situation became what it was going to be. Ethan was one person with a standard-issue sidearm and a ceremonial blade he had not expected to use and a fractured understanding of Korvan combat training. And the 4 soldiers advancing on him were large and fast and had been doing this specific kind of work for years. By the math of the room the situation should have been resolved in a very short time and resolved in only one direction. But mathematics of that kind tend to leave out the variable of what a person has already decided before the fighting starts. Ethan had decided, clearly. In the moment Velshera pressed her face into his shoulder, in the moment he felt how hard she was holding on, that he was not moving from in front of her. That decision was not complicated. It did not need to be re-evaluated as the first soldier reached him. It was simply the condition of the next several minutes, the fixed point everything else would have to move around. The first exchange was fast and very close and not particularly dignified for either party. The soldier was trained for clean takedowns against species his own size, and Ethan was trained for situations where the person trying to remove him was bigger than him, which was a more common situation for a human soldier in this part of the galaxy than Military Academy had originally prepared him for. The result was a collision of 2 sets of practiced responses, and both of them registered the impact in the way that impacts get registered when people are not padded for them. Ethan's left forearm cracked against the soldier's elbow guard. The pain was immediate and significant, and he filed it in the part of his brain that was handling the ongoing inventory of what was currently wrong and would need attention when there was attention to spare. He kept moving. He was not trying to defeat 4 large soldiers in a fair fight. He was trying to stay upright and in front of Velshera long enough for the situation to become too complicated and too public for the warlord to continue without the political cost becoming larger than whatever he was trying to accomplish. And the situation was already being recorded by 17 separate devices that Ethan had counted in the gallery, including the shriven delegate who had not lowered her device once, which meant that every second this continued was another second of evidence being compiled by watching species who had started this event with neutral positions and were currently watching 4 Corvan soldiers attempt to remove a human sergeant by force from in front of a frightened woman in the middle of the conclave's neutral ground. The gash opened along his left shoulder at the second minute, a blade he did not fully track in time, more a graze than a proper cut but deep enough that the uniform darkened along the sleeve in a way that was visible to the gallery, and he heard somewhere behind him a sharp and involuntary sound from Velshera that was probably the closest thing she had to a word for no, stop, that is a person who is bleeding and the bleeding is because of me. He did not look back at her. He trusted the sound in her voice to mean she was still standing and still behind him, and that was the relevant information for the current moment. And then something changed. It did not change because Ethan gained the upper hand. He had not, he was one person, and he was tired, and his arm was fractured, and his shoulder was bleeding, and the 4th soldier had just found a grip on him that was going to be very difficult to break in the next several seconds. It changed because High Warden Ounsketh moved. Not toward Ethan. Ounsketh walked across the ceremony floor with the measured and deliberate steps of a commander who has made a decision he will not be revisiting, his honor guard falling in behind him in perfect formation, and he placed himself and his 12 soldiers between Ethan and the 4 Corvan with the physical clarity of a line being drawn. The 4th soldier released Ethan. The hall went silent again, a different silence than before. Not the silence of a room that does not have a response, but the silence of a room watching something it did not expect and is trying to understand. Ounsketh did not look at Ethan immediately. He looked at the Corvan soldiers with the expression of a Vethkai High Warden informing for foreign soldiers that they were currently standing in a location that it would be in their interest to stop standing in, and he said nothing because the expression was sufficient and the 12 armored soldiers behind him were also sufficient. The Corvan looked at their warlord. The warlord looked at the gallery. The gallery was still recording. The warlord withdrew. His delegation folded behind him and practiced order, and he moved toward the hall's secondary exit with the bearing of someone who will be claiming later that he was not retreating but making a considered and tactical adjustment, and everyone in the room would see that recording later and form their own opinions about the terminology. When the Corvan delegation had cleared the floor, Ounsketh finally turned and looked at Ethan. The human sergeant was standing with a fractured left arm and a bleeding shoulder and his sidearm still in his right hand and his back still technically toward the position where Velshera was standing. Even now, even with the immediate threat gone, his body was still oriented the same way it had been oriented since she ran into his arms, still between her and the room. Ounsketh looked at him for a long time. Then he said, in rough and careful standard, each word chosen with the deliberateness of someone working in a language that is not native to them but needs the thought to land correctly, "You held her when we did not. Honor is honor." He said nothing else. He did not need to say anything else. The 12 guards of the Vethkai Honor Unit took positions around the perimeter of the space where Ethan and Velshera stood, not confining them, not surrounding them in any threatening sense, but covering the angles of the room the way a protective formation covers angles, the way soldiers cover the people they have decided are worth covering. Ethan lowered his sidearm. He found the steps of the Grand Hall by feel more than sight because his left arm was sending him very insistent and detailed information about itself that was making it difficult to concentrate on other things. He sat down on the wide stone steps that led up to the ceremony platform, and he set his sidearm on the step beside him, and he pressed his right hand against his shoulder and breathed. Velshera sat next to him. Her skin was a steady and warm amber now, not the trembling fractured gold of the earlier shelter signal, but something fuller and quieter and more settled, the amber of someone who is exhausted and has stopped being afraid and is currently feeling the full weight of everything that has happened in the last several hours all at once. Ambassador Reyes walked over and stood in front of them both and looked at them with the face of a man composing in real time the most difficult official report he had ever been asked to write. Ethan looked up at him. Reyes said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "You know they are recommending a court-martial." Ethan nodded once. Reyes said, 9 species have also submitted formal commendation requests to the Conclave Record Office in the last 12 minutes. Ethan looked at his arm. "I am going to need a medic," he said 3 weeks past. The conclave moved in. The way that large and ancient institutions move when something unexpected has forced them to look at themselves, slowly, carefully, with a great deal of formal language surrounding a core of genuine discomfort. The right of accord between the Vethkai noble house and the Corvan hegemony had been formally suspended pending a full review by the conclave's legal assembly. This was the first time in 217 years that a binding right had been halted after the ceremony had already begun. The previous time involved a weapons dispute between two species whose conflict had reshaped an entire sector of the galaxy. So the company Ethan's decision was keeping was not modest company by any standard. The review was ongoing and its outcome was not yet known, but the direction of it was becoming visible to people who watched the conclave closely. The recording made by the shriven delegate had been seen by representatives of 31 member species within the first 6 hours after the event. And what those representatives had seen when they watched it had produced a series of formal position statements that were still arriving at the conclave's record office in a steady and building stream. And most of them were not written in the warlord's favor. Humanity's observer status had not been revoked. It had, in fact, been placed under review for an entirely different reason, not for sanction but for potential elevation, a distinction that Ambassador Reyes had communicated to Earth's diplomatic office with the expression of a man who was not yet sure whether he was angry or relieved and had decided to simply be exhausted until he worked it out. Ethan knew about the elevation review the same way he knew about most things in his current situation. People told him things while he was lying in the conclave's medical bay with his left arm in a regenerative splint and his shoulder sealed under a bioadhesive bandage and nowhere in particular to be while the political machinery worked through its process around him. He was not particularly bothered by the waiting. He had a window in the medical bay that looked out at the slow rotation of the asteroid's outer shell, and the stars beyond it were extremely patient company, and he had always been better at stillness than most people gave him credit for at first meeting. Velshera visited every day. She did not stay long on most days. There were things she was required to attend, discussions she was being called into by the conclave's review process, communications with her house on Vethkai space that she handled in private and came back from looking tired but not frightened, which Ethan considered a meaningful improvement over every look she had been carrying when he first noticed her in the Grand Hall. On the last day before she was scheduled to depart for her home world, she came to the medical bay in the late part of the station's artificial evening cycle, when the overhead lights had dimmed to their night setting and the corridor outside was quiet, and she sat in the chair beside his bed and her skin held the color that he had started to recognize over 3 weeks of daily visits, the warm and full amber that he now associated with her when she was present and calm and choosing to be somewhere rather than being required to be there. She asked him why he had held her. She asked it directly and without the formal framing that the Vethkai used for most serious questions, not as a ceremonial inquiry or a diplomatic formality, but as a person asking a real question to another person because they genuinely needed to understand the answer. Ethan thought about it. He was not a person who gave quick answers to questions that deserved careful ones. He had learned somewhere along 14 years of service that the questions worth answering were worth the extra seconds it took to answer them correctly rather than fast. He told her that he had been standing in that hall watching people, the way he watched rooms, the way he had been watching rooms his entire career, and he had seen someone who was scared and alone in a space full of people who were not going to help them, and he had seen the moment. She looked across the room and found the only face that had noticed, and he had understood what she was asking before she ran because he had seen that kind of asking before. He told her it was not a political calculation. He told her it was not a heroic decision or a brave one in any way he thought the word brave was usually meant. It was just a thing he did not know how to walk past, the same way he imagined most people could not walk past a person sitting on the ground in the rain. The same way a certain kind of attention to other people becomes so much a part of how you move through the world that you stop experiencing it as a choice and start experiencing it as simply the direction your feet go when the situation presents itself. She was quiet for a while after he finished. Then she told him that she had watched 43 species look away. She did not say it with bitterness. She said it with the careful and factual tone of someone stating something they have had 3 weeks to process and have processed as fully as they are going to for now. But the amber of her skin deepened slightly when she said it, a small involuntary shift toward the richer color she carried when something landed in a tender place. Ethan said, quietly, that he knew. He said that he had noticed humans were often in the dim corners of rooms like that one, and that maybe being in the corner for a long time gave a person a particular kind of vision for other people in corners, a familiarity with what that looked like from the inside that the center of the room did not naturally develop. She looked at him for a long time after he said that. Then she stood and she took his right hand in her upper 2 hands and she pressed her lower 2 hands together with her palms flat and her fingers aligned and she held them out toward him in a gesture that he had not seen in 3 weeks of observing Vethkai interaction in the halls and corridors of the station. A formal wrist clasp, but not the kind exchanged between a noble and a delegate or a guard and a commander, the kind exchanged between equals who have looked at each other clearly and found something real in what they saw. He returned it as best he could with one working arm. Before she left, she pressed something small into his palm and closed his fingers around it, a smooth and slightly warm object the size of a large coin, flat and rounded at the edges, and when she released his hand and stepped back it was pulsing with a gentle light, a color that was difficult to name in any language Ethan had access to, a soft and steady blue-white that was quieter and warmer than either blue or white usually managed to be on their own. He did not know what the color meant. He held it anyway and watched her walk to the door and turn once at the threshold and look back at him with her skin at that full amber that he had come to know meant she was choosing to be somewhere, and then she was gone into the quiet corridor of the station's night cycle. He would learn later, 3 days later, from a xenobiologist on the Conclave's academic staff who saw the object in his hand during a routine medical check and became very still for a moment before explaining, that the color Velshera had left pulsing in his palm was the color that Vethkai children produce involuntarily when they feel completely safe for the first time in a place they did not expect to feel safe, a color that the Vethkai do not teach and cannot control and cannot produce. On purpose, only genuinely and only once per new safety, and that there was no adult record in any Vethkai cultural archive of a grown person producing it. The xenobiologist did not have an explanation for that. Ethan did not offer one. He walked back to his post beside Ambassador Reyes the following morning with his arm in a lighter support brace and his shoulder healed cleanly under new skin and the small object tucked into the inner pocket of his dress uniform jacket against his chest where it was warm and still and continued its quiet pulse at the rhythm of a slow and steady breath. Reyes informed him without looking up from his communication tablet that 9 species had now submitted formal commendation requests on Ethan's behalf to the Earth government, that the court-martial recommendation from his own branch had been downgraded to a formal review that 3 senior officers had already declined to participate in, and that the Conclave's Elevation Committee had requested a direct conversation with Earth's diplomatic leadership within the month. You should know, Reyes added, still not looking up, that you have made my job simultaneously much harder and considerably more interesting, and I am not yet sure which of those things is going to matter more. Ethan straightened his jacket. He looked out at the grand hall where the ceremony floor had been cleaned and reset and the banners of 43 species hung in their arranged positions, with Earth's banner in the far and dim corner near the back wall where he stood, the place that no one important ever stood, the place where the room was easy to see from in every direction. He looked at the banner for a long time. Then he looked at everything else, the full sweep of the hall, the high ceiling with its scattered crystal light, the witness positions where delegates would stand, the exits, the ceremony floor at the center where the light was brightest and the attention of every important person in the galaxy would fall when the next rite of accord was announced and the next gathering assembled and the next large and ancient institution arranged itself to conduct the business of a galaxy that was still, slowly, and with great difficulty, learning what it wanted to be. He looked at all of it from the corner. The corner, he decided, was a fine place to see from. For now.